A chance encounter that changed everything. Daniel Carter had always believed in the power of education. As a history teacher in Boston, he had spent years trying to inspire young minds, but something had always felt missing. His life was comfortable, but it lacked true purpose. When he came across an international volunteer program to teach underprivileged children, something inside him urged him to sign up. At 42, Daniel found himself on a plane to Nigeria, a country he had only read about in books. The moment he stepped out of the airport in Lagos, the heat pressed against his skin, and the chaotic symphony of the bustling city overwhelmed his senses. The streets were alive, vendors shouting, cars honking, and children weaving through the crowds. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced. But his real journey began when he traveled to Makoko, an area known for its floating slums. His volunteer work was supposed to take him to a school nearby, but before that, he made an unscheduled stop at St. Mary's Orphanage. It was there, in the dusty courtyard, that his life changed forever. A silent corner in a noisy world. The orphanage was nothing like he had imagined. It wasn't a sad, dreary place, it was alive with laughter and energy. Children ran around barefoot, their faces bright with joy despite the worn-out conditions of their surroundings. Volunteers and caretakers moved busily, trying to keep up with the chaos. But something caught Daniel's attention. In the farthest corner of the yard, beneath the shade of an old baobab tree, 6 little girls sat together in silence. They weren't playing like the others. They weren't laughing. They were drawing. Daniel approached, his curiosity piqued. Their tiny hands clutched broken crayons, gliding over sheets of crumpled paper. He knelt beside them and studied their drawings. Each paper was filled with the same image, rainbows. Vibrant, colorful rainbows stretching across empty skies. For a moment, none of the girls spoke. They just looked up at him with wide, cautious eyes. They were young, maybe 6 or 7 years old, their small frames wrapped in second-hand clothes that barely fit. Daniel picked up a crayon and smiled. "May I join?" The smallest girl hesitated, then slowly handed him a red crayon. It was barely an inch long, worn down from use. He took it carefully, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. "Thank you. I'm Daniel." The girls exchanged glances before one of them, bolder than the rest, finally whispered, "Hope." Hope. A name filled with so much meaning. She pointed to the others, introducing them one by one, Grace, Faith, Naomi, Esther, and Joy. Daniel felt a strange, unexplainable warmth in his chest as he repeated their names. "Your drawings are beautiful," he said, gesturing to the rainbows. "Why do you all draw the same thing?" Hope glanced at her sisters, then looked down at her drawing. "Because rainbows mean a new beginning." Her voice was soft, yet powerful. "A new beginning." Daniel frowned. "Who told you that?" For the first time, their silence was not just shyness, it was sadness. Hope's small fingers gripped her paper tightly. "We did." Daniel didn't know what to say. He had met many children in his life, but none who carried this kind of quiet pain. Just then, a voice broke the silence. "Mr. Carter, I see you've met our forgotten ones." Daniel turned to find an older woman approaching, her kind face lined with years of exhaustion. She wore a modest dress and a simple cross around her neck, Sister Agatha, the orphanage's director. "Forgotten?" Daniel repeated, looking back at the 6 little girls. Sister Agatha sighed. "They have been here the longest. No one adopts them." Daniel frowned. "Why not?" She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Because they were abandoned together. They aren't blood sisters, but they were all found on the same night. No one knows where they came from. People believe they are cursed." Daniel's stomach twisted. "Cursed?" Sister Agatha nodded solemnly. Superstitions run deep here. Some people say they were left behind because of a bad omen. That they bring misfortune. She shook her head, her voice filled with quiet frustration. It is nonsense, of course, but beliefs are hard to change. Daniel looked at the 6 girls again. They had drawn closer together, as if shielding themselves from the world. They weren't cursed. They weren't bad luck. They were just children, children who had been abandoned and left to carry a burden they didn't deserve. A lump formed in his throat. He couldn't understand how anyone could look at them and see misfortune. All he saw was innocence. A decision that couldn't be ignored. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. The image of the 6 little girls haunted him. Their quiet sadness, their drawings of rainbows, their hope for something better, it all clung to him. He thought about their names. Hope. Grace. Faith. Naomi. Esther. Joy. They had chosen to call themselves after things they wanted most in life. Daniel turned over in his small guest room, staring at the cracked ceiling. He was just a teacher. He had never thought about adopting a child, let alone 6. But as the hours passed, a thought settled deep in his heart. What if he was the one meant to give them a home? It was ridiculous. Impossible. A single man from America, adopting 6 orphaned girls from Nigeria? The logistics alone were overwhelming. And yet, when he closed his eyes, he saw only one thing: 6 little girls drawing rainbows under the shade of a tree, waiting for someone to tell them they were not forgotten. By the time the sun rose, Daniel had made his decision. He was going to fight for them. No matter what it took, the fight for a family. Daniel had always believed that every child deserved a chance. But as he sat across from Sister Agatha in her tiny office, he realized just how complicated that belief could be in reality. The orphanage director studied him carefully, her fingers tapping against the worn wooden desk. The smell of old books and fresh bread from the nearby kitchen filled the room, but Daniel barely noticed. His heart pounded. "You want to adopt them?" she asked, her voice measured. Daniel nodded. "Yes. All 6 of them." Sister Agatha exhaled, leaning back in her chair. "Mr. Carter, do you know how difficult that would be? International adoption is not simple. You are an unmarried man. You have no experience raising children. And adopting 6 at once?" She shook her head. "It is unusual, to say the least." Daniel swallowed hard. He had expected resistance. He had even told himself he was prepared for it. But hearing it aloud made the weight of his decision feel heavier. "I know it's complicated," he admitted, his voice steady. "But I can't just walk away. Those girls, they've been here for years, waiting for someone to see them. And I do. I see them, Sister Agatha." The older woman sighed, rubbing her temples. "You have a good heart, Mr. Carter. But good intentions are not enough." Daniel clenched his fists. "Then tell me what is enough. What do I need to do?" A battle of paperwork and patience. Sister Agatha agreed to let him begin the process, but she made no promises. Adoption required approvals from both the Nigerian and American governments. It meant months, possibly years, of waiting, paperwork, and legal battles. Daniel spent the next few weeks meeting with lawyers, social workers, and government officials. Every time he thought he had made progress, another roadblock appeared. "You are not married," one official told him, shaking his head. "A single man adopting 6 girls? It is not the norm." Daniel forced himself to stay calm. "I understand, sir. But norms don't always account for what's right." Another woman reviewing his case frowned at the documents. "You do not live in Nigeria. How will they adjust to life in America?" "They will have a home," Daniel said firmly. "A real family. It wasn't just paperwork that stood in his way. Some people at the orphanage whispered about the girls, reinforcing the old superstitions. "They are different," a caretaker muttered under her breath one afternoon. "Something about them, it's unnatural." Daniel gritted his teeth. "They're just children." But the rumors never stopped. One evening, as Daniel sat outside watching the girls play, Hope walked up to him, her small hands clenched. "They won't let you take us, will they?" she asked softly. Daniel's chest tightened. "I won't give up, Hope. I promise." She hesitated, her dark eyes searching his face for the truth. Then, without warning, she threw her arms around him. Daniel froze. Hope had never initiated contact before. The other girls followed, one by one, until all 6 of them huddled around him. For the first time since he arrived, he felt it. Not obligation. Not responsibility. Family. An unexpected ally. Just as Daniel began losing hope, Sister Agatha called him into her office. "I have a contact," she said, handing him a card. "A judge who believes in cases like yours. He might be able to help." Daniel didn't hesitate. He traveled to Abuja, the capital, to meet Judge Okafor. The man was tall, with a sharp gaze that seemed to see through people. He listened carefully as Daniel spoke about the girls. When Daniel finished, the judge leaned forward. "You would give up your comfortable life in America for 6 orphaned girls?" "Not give up," Daniel corrected. "I would share my life with them." A slow smile spread across Judge Okafor's face. "Then let's see what we can do." The next few months were a blur of legal documents, interviews, and court hearings. There were setbacks, times when Daniel thought he would never succeed. But each time, he reminded himself of 6 little girls who had never been chosen. And he kept fighting. A new beginning. A year later, Daniel stood in front of a judge in a small Nigerian courtroom. His hands trembled as he listened to the final ruling. It is the decision of this court that Daniel Carter is granted full legal custody of Hope, Grace, Faith, Naomi, Esther, and Joy. The room erupted in murmurs. Daniel barely heard them. His heart pounded as the words sank in. The judge looked at him. "Mr. Carter, you are now their father." Daniel turned to the girls, his vision blurred with tears. Hope was the first to move, running straight into his arms. The others followed, their small bodies pressing against him as they sobbed with relief. They weren't forgotten anymore. They were home, the journey home. The airport was a whirlwind of noise and movement, announcements echoing over the speakers, travelers rushing past with rolling suitcases, and the ever-present scent of coffee and jet fuel lingering in the air. But for Daniel, everything felt surreal. Standing near the departure gate with his 6 daughters, he took a deep breath. It was finally happening. After a year of legal battles, endless paperwork, and moments of doubt, they were boarding a plane to America, to their new home, a place the girls had only ever dreamed about. Hope clung to his hand, her eyes darting nervously around the unfamiliar surroundings. Grace and Naomi whispered to each other, trying to hide their nervousness. Joy, the youngest, kept close to Faith, her tiny fingers gripping her sister's sleeve. Esther, usually the quietest, stood still, her dark eyes watching Daniel carefully. Daniel knelt down to meet their eye level. "Are you ready?" he asked softly. They exchanged glances. Finally, Naomi spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if we don't fit in?" Daniel felt a pang in his chest. He had expected this fear. These girls had spent their entire lives being unwanted, being seen as different, even in their own country. He smiled gently. "You don't have to fit in. You just have to be yourselves. And wherever we are together, that's home." Hope squeezed his hand. The other girls nodded hesitantly. Home. The flight of a lifetime. The flight was long, nearly 16 hours, with a layover in London. The girls had never been on an airplane before, and their emotions shifted between awe and anxiety. Joy kept her nose pressed to the window, staring at the vast sky. "We're in the clouds," she whispered in amazement. Naomi tapped the screen on the seat in front of her, exploring the in-flight entertainment like a scientist on a mission. "There are movies in here?" Grace, meanwhile, gripped her armrests as the plane took off, her eyes shut tight. Daniel rubbed her back reassuringly. "It's okay," he said softly. "It feels strange at first, but you're safe." The plane steadied, and the girls slowly began to relax. Flight attendants walked by, offering drinks and small meals, which fascinated them. They weren't used to being served like this. Hours passed, and one by one, the girls fell asleep, their bodies curled up in their seats. Daniel sat awake, watching them, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. This was just the beginning. Would they be happy in America? Would they face discrimination? Would he be enough for them? Doubt crept in, but then joy shifted in her sleep, her tiny hand resting on his arm. The simple gesture made something inside him settle. He wasn't alone. And neither were they. A new world. When they landed in New York, the girls were overwhelmed. The airport was bigger than anything they had ever seen, with high ceilings, bright lights, and thousands of people moving in all directions. The noise, the pace, the sheer size of everything, it was like stepping onto another planet. Daniel guided them through customs and baggage claim, their eyes wide as they took in their new world. As they walked toward the exit, Hope tugged on his sleeve. "It's cold," she whispered. Daniel grinned. "Welcome to winter in America." He pulled out 6 small coats he had brought for them, helping them put them on. They had never experienced real cold before, and their breath came out in little puffs of white as they stepped outside. Waiting at the curb was a van, a surprise Daniel had arranged. The side was decorated with colorful balloons, and in the driver's seat sat his best friend, Mark. "Welcome home." Mark cheered as he stepped out, pulling Daniel into a hug. Then he turned to the girls, his eyes warm. "And welcome to America, ladies." The girls shuffled nervously. Mark crouched down to their level. "I know this is all new," he said gently. "But you're gonna love it here." They hesitated, then slowly nodded. Daniel loaded their luggage, and they piled into the van. As they drove through the city, the girls pressed their faces against the windows, staring at the towering skyscrapers, the flashing billboards, the people wrapped in scarves and coats, rushing down the sidewalks. "It's like a movie," Naomi whispered. Daniel chuckled. "Wait until you see where we're going next. A house becomes a home." 2 hours later, they arrived in a quiet suburban neighborhood, a stark contrast to the chaotic city. Snow covered the rooftops and lawns, making everything look like a postcard. Daniel pulled into the driveway of a 2-story house with a wraparound porch. The girls hesitated as they stepped out, unsure of what to expect. "This is your home," Daniel said softly. They turned to him in surprise. "Our home?" Faith echoed. Daniel nodded. "Come inside." The front door opened, revealing a cozy living room with a crackling fireplace, a huge couch, and a Christmas tree decorated with twinkling lights. The girls hesitated on the threshold. Then, Hope stepped forward. She touched the doorknob with trembling fingers, then slowly walked inside. The others followed, taking in the soft carpet, the pictures on the walls, the warmth of the fire. Daniel led them upstairs, showing them their rooms, each with a bed, a closet, and a window looking out at the snowy street. Naomi ran her fingers over the bookshelves filled with colorful stories. Grace touched the soft pillows in awe. Joy opened her closet, gasping at the tiny clothes hanging inside, real clothes, not hand-me-downs. Faith turned to Daniel, her voice shaking. This is ours? He nodded. Everything in this house belongs to you. This is where we start our life together. Tears welled in Esther's eyes. She had never cried in front of him before. But now, she let the tears fall. Hope ran to him first, throwing her arms around him. Then, one by one, the other girls followed, wrapping him in a hug so tight it took his breath away. "Thank you," Grace whispered. Daniel closed his eyes, holding them close. They were home. And for the first time in their lives, they belonged. Learning to be loved. The first few weeks in America were overwhelming for the girls. The house was warm and inviting, but it was still foreign. The neighborhood was safe, but they didn't know anyone. The food was abundant, but they weren't used to the flavors. Everything was new. Everything was different. And they were waiting for it all to disappear. A house full of fear. Daniel began noticing patterns. The girls were hesitant about everything, touching things in the house, asking for food, even speaking up. When he cooked meals, they would eat slowly, cautiously, as if afraid it was a mistake. When he gave them gifts, new clothes, school supplies, even toys, they would take them silently, folding them neatly and storing them away without using them. And the most heartbreaking of all. They didn't unpack their suitcases. Each night, Daniel peeked into their rooms to find their few belongings still in their bags, neatly zipped up, ready to leave at a moment's notice. It shattered him. One night, as he passed Naomi and Grace's shared room, he heard whispers. He paused, listening. "We shouldn't get too comfortable," Naomi murmured. "This might not last." "It never does," Grace whispered back. Daniel clenched his jaw, fighting back tears. These girls had lived their whole lives being abandoned. Even though they were home, they didn't believe it. And he didn't know how to fix that. The breaking point. One evening, Daniel found Hope standing by the front door, fully dressed, her small hands clutching her old suitcase. His heart stopped. "Hope." He crouched in front of her. "What are you doing?" She avoided his eyes. "It's okay if you don't want us anymore. We understand. We won't make it hard." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. She really thought she was being abandoned again. Slowly, carefully, he took the suitcase from her hands and placed it on the floor. Then, he pulled her into a hug. She was stiff at first, unaccustomed to affection, but he held her tighter. "I will never send you away," he whispered. "This is your home. Forever." Hope didn't respond, but she didn't pull away either. It was a small step. That night, Daniel sat in his study, running a hand through his hair. How do I show them they're safe? Then it hit him. They needed something permanent. Something they could see. Something that proved they belonged. A family ritual. The next morning, Daniel gathered the girls in the living room. "I want to show you something," he said. He led them into the backyard, where a wooden fence stretched along the perimeter. In his hands, he held a bucket of paint and 6 paintbrushes. The girls exchanged confused glances. "Come here." He dipped a brush into the paint and pressed his hand against the wood, leaving a bright-colored handprint. "This is my mark. It means this is my home. And now, I want you to add yours." They hesitated. Then Joy stepped forward. She dipped her tiny hand into the paint and pressed it against the wood. A small, colorful print remained. One by one, the others followed. By the time they were finished, the fence was covered in bright, overlapping handprints. "This means you belong here," Daniel said softly. "No one can take this away." For the first time since arriving, the girls smiled. That night, for the first time, they unpacked their suitcases. School and struggles. The next big challenge was school. Enrolling them was easy, helping them adjust was not. The first week was full of tears. The girls struggled with English. Other kids stared at them, whispering behind their backs. Teachers tried to be patient, but it was clear they weren't used to handling students with so much trauma. Grace refused to speak in class. Naomi flinched whenever a teacher raised their voice. Esther stayed glued to Joy's side, afraid of being separated. At lunch, they huddled together, eating quickly, avoiding attention. Daniel's heart broke every time he picked them up, seeing the exhaustion in their eyes. That weekend, he sat them down. "Tell me how I can help." Naomi looked down. "We don't belong here," she whispered. "You do," Daniel said firmly. "You just don't believe it yet." He thought for a moment. Then, he smiled. "How about this, every time something bad happens, we'll turn it into something good. A challenge, a game." They hesitated. "Like what?" "Let's say someone laughs at your English," he said. "Instead of getting sad, you go home and learn one new word to surprise them tomorrow." The girls exchanged looks. "And if someone is mean to you?" "Then you be extra kind to them," Daniel said. "Kindness confuses mean people." Slowly, the girls smiled. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it gave them power. And little by little, they started fighting back, not with anger, but with determination. Finding their voices. Over the next few months, small victories turned into big ones. Naomi practiced English every night and was soon the best reader in her class. Grace joined the art club and painted the most beautiful portraits the school had ever seen. Esther and Joy started making friends, learning to trust other kids. Hope, the shyest of them all, surprised everyone when she stood up to a boy who made fun of her accent. "At least I know 2 languages," she said coolly. "How many do you know?" The boy shut up. Daniel couldn't have been prouder. But the biggest surprise came from Faith. One day, she approached him, holding out a school flyer. "I want to try this," she said softly. Daniel looked at the paper. It was for a talent show. "You want to perform?" he asked in surprise. Faith nodded. "I want to sing." Daniel's eyes softened. "Then let's practice." The talent show. The auditorium was packed. Parents, teachers, and students filled the seats, chatting excitedly. Backstage, Faith stood frozen, gripping her microphone. Daniel crouched beside her. "Are you nervous?" She nodded quickly. "You don't have to do this," he said gently. She took a deep breath. "I want to." Then the curtain lifted. Faith walked onto the stage. At first, her voice was quiet, shaking. Then, with each note, she grew stronger. The room fell silent. By the end, people were crying. The crowd erupted into applause. Daniel stood in the audience, tears in his eyes. She had found her voice. And for the first time, the girls weren't just surviving. They were thriving, the bond that couldn't be broken. The warmth of acceptance had finally begun to seep into the hearts of the 6 girls. Yet, despite the love Daniel poured into them, despite the victories they had achieved, there were still wounds that hadn't healed, wounds that ran deep, scars that whispered of abandonment, of the fear that love was temporary. Daniel knew this. He saw it in the way they still hesitated to call him Dad. He saw it in the way they never asked for things, as if afraid it was too much. He saw it in the way they still flinched when he raised his voice, even when he wasn't angry. Healing took time. And they had come so far. But he wanted them to understand, truly understand, that they weren't alone. That no matter what happened, they were family. And then, something happened that would test the very foundation of their bond. A letter from the past. One crisp autumn morning, while the girls were at school, Daniel checked the mail. At first, it was the usual, bills, advertisements, a couple of letters from friends. But then, at the bottom of the pile, he found an envelope that made his stomach tighten. It was from a woman named Anita Kumba. His hands trembled as he opened it. Dear Mr. Daniels, I hope this letter finds you well. I have recently learned that my daughters, whom I left many years ago, are now in your care. I want to see them. Please allow me to meet them. His breath caught in his throat. The girl's biological mother. He had been told she abandoned them at the orphanage when they were young, leaving without a trace. There had been no word from her in almost 2 decades. And now, suddenly, she wanted to return. Daniel felt a storm brewing inside him. He had raised them. He had been there for every nightmare, every scraped knee, every tearful moment when they thought the world had forgotten them. Now she wanted to step in. What if seeing her reopened old wounds? What if they wanted to leave? His heart ached at the thought. The decision. That evening, Daniel sat the girls down. There's something we need to talk about. His voice was steady, but inside, he was anything but. The girls, now teenagers, gathered around, sensing his seriousness. You received bad news? Grace asked. Daniel hesitated. Not bad, exactly. But, complicated. He took a breath. Your mother reached out. Silence. Naomi stiffened. Faith's hands curled into fists. Hope's eyes darted around as if searching for an escape. She wrote me a letter. She wants to see you. For a moment, no one spoke. The weight of the words hung in the air like a thick fog. Then, Naomi scoffed. She wants to see us. Now? After 20 years? I don't trust her, Grace muttered. She left us. Joy's voice was small, but firm. Daniel's heart ached for them. You don't have to see her if you don't want to. This is your decision. Another silence. Then, to his surprise, Esther spoke. I think I want to hear what she has to say. The others turned to her in shock. She abandoned us, Naomi hissed. Why would you care what she has to say? I don't care, Esther said softly. But I want to understand why. That was all it took. One by one, they all agreed. And so, the meeting was arranged. A face from the past. A week later, Daniel sat with them in a quiet cafe, waiting. The girls were tense. Their bodies were rigid, hands gripping the edges of their chairs. Even now, after years of love and security, the past had a way of creeping back in. Then, the door opened. A woman stepped inside, looking older than Daniel expected. Life had aged her beyond her years, wrinkles lined her face, and her eyes held a sadness that never faded. Anita Kumba. She hesitated before walking toward them, clutching her purse like a lifeline. When she reached their table, her lips trembled. My daughters. No one responded. She sat down slowly, her hands shaking. I don't expect you to forgive me, she whispered. I need you to know that leaving you was the hardest thing I ever did. Faith's jaw clenched. Then why did you do it? Tears welled in Anita's eyes. I was young. Alone. Your father had died. I had no money, no way to feed you. I thought leaving you at the orphanage would be better than watching you starve. Naomi's fists tightened. You never came back. I was afraid, Anita admitted. And by the time I wanted to return, I had nothing to offer you. And then, years passed, and I convinced myself that you would be better off never knowing me. Tears spilled down her cheeks. The girl sat in silence, processing. Finally, Grace spoke. So why now? Anita took a shaky breath. Because I never stopped loving you. And because I had to tell you myself. I'm sick. I don't have much time left. Daniel felt his stomach drop. For the first time, the girl's expressions changed. Anger shifted into something softer. Conflicted. Anita wiped her tears. I don't expect anything. I just wanted to see your faces one last time. A heavy silence followed. Then, to Daniel's astonishment, Hope, the quietest of them all, reached across the table and took Anita's hand. And just like that, the ice began to melt. Closure and healing. Over the next few weeks, the girls visited Anita in the hospital. They were cautious, guarded, but as the days passed, walls started to break down. They asked her questions. About their father. About the life she had before them. About why she never came back sooner. Some wounds never fully heal, but for the first time, they started to understand. And when Anita took her last breath, she did so knowing she was no longer a stranger to them. Family, forever. The day of the funeral was quiet. The girls stood side by side, their hands interlocked. Afterward, as they returned home, Daniel noticed something different in them. They seemed lighter. Like a weight had been lifted. That night, as he was about to head to bed, he heard a soft knock on his door. He turned to see the 6 girls standing there. Naomi spoke first. We've been thinking. About what? He asked. Grace took a deep breath. We never really said it before, but we want you to know. They exchanged glances. Then, in unison, they said it. You are our father. Daniel's breath hitched. Tears welled in his eyes as he pulled them into his arms. He had given them a home. He had given them love. And now, finally, they believed it. They were a family. For good. A legacy of love. The years had shaped them in ways neither Daniel or the 6 girls could have ever imagined. What had begun as a desperate attempt to escape a bleak future had turned into a journey of healing, growth, and, ultimately, unbreakable love. But this was not the end of their story. This was the beginning of a new chapter. And none of them knew just how far their bond, their journey, and their gratitude would take them. Dreams set in motion. With Anita's passing, a chapter of their past had finally closed. The confrontation with their mother had given them the closure they never thought they needed. It was not forgiveness in the traditional sense, but it was acceptance. Acceptance of what was, of what had happened, and most importantly, of who they had become. And now, as they stood together, looking towards the future, they knew it was time to give back. Each of the 6 girls had grown into remarkable young women, all pursuing dreams they had once thought impossible. Naomi, the fierce and determined one, had taken up law, determined to fight for children who were abandoned just as she had been. Grace, the quiet observer with a heart of gold, had found her passion in counseling, helping young girls overcome trauma. Faith, the strong-willed and passionate soul, had pursued journalism, wanting to uncover the injustices of the world. Hope, the artist at heart, had channeled her pain into paintings, each one telling a story of resilience and hope. Joy, the healer of the family, had enrolled in medical school, vowing to one day return to Africa and serve the underprivileged. Esther, the dreamer, had chosen education, believing that the cycle of poverty and neglect could be broken through knowledge. They had come so far. And now, they wanted to honor the man who had given them everything. A surprise for Daniel. One morning, the 6 sisters sat together at the dining table, a thick folder resting between them. The air buzzed with excitement, nerves, and anticipation. Naomi tapped her fingers against the wooden surface. Are we sure about this? Grace smiled. More than ever. Hope nodded. It's time. Daniel, now in his 60s, walked into the room with a cup of coffee, raising a curious eyebrow at their expressions. All right, what's going on here? You all look like you're plotting something. Naomi slid the folder toward him. We need you to read this. With a skeptical look, Daniel opened the folder and began flipping through the pages. Then, he stopped. His breath hitched as he read the words on the official documents. His hands trembled slightly as he looked up at them. This is an adoption certificate. 6 adoption certificates. Each one bearing the name of one of the girls. Each one officially making them his daughters. Surprise! Joy said, her eyes twinkling with unshed tears. For a moment, Daniel couldn't speak. He could only stare at them, his heart pounding in his chest. "You've always been our father," Faith said softly. "And we wanted to make it official." Daniel swallowed hard, overwhelmed with emotion. I don't know what to say." Hope smiled. "Just say yes, Dad." Tears slipped down his face as he nodded. "Yes. 1,000 times, yes." And with that, after 20 years, Daniel finally, legally, officially became their father. But the surprises weren't over yet. Returning to where it all began. A few months later, the 6 sisters and Daniel boarded a plane to Africa. They were returning to the place where it all started. It had been 2 decades since Daniel had first walked into that orphanage, meeting 6 frightened girls who clung to each other like lifelines. And now, they were coming back, not as abandoned children, but as empowered women ready to make a difference. When they arrived, the orphanage had changed. The building was older, the paint peeling, the grounds overgrown. But the same air of sadness lingered. Children still sat on the steps, waiting. Hoping. Daniel and the girls spent the day talking to the children, playing with them, hearing their stories. And by the end of it, they knew exactly what they had to do. They were going to build something new. Something bigger. Something better. Something that would ensure no child would ever feel as lost as they once had. The Daniels Foundation. Over the next year, the sisters worked tirelessly to establish the Daniels Foundation for Children, named in honor of the man who had saved them. With Naomi's legal expertise, Grace's counseling knowledge, Faith's journalism connections, and the talents of each sister combined, they raised enough funds to transform the orphanage into a thriving safe haven. They built classrooms. They hired teachers. They provided medical care. And, most importantly, they gave children something they had once thought impossible, a future. Daniel stood at the grand opening, tears in his eyes as he watched his daughters cut the ribbon, officially opening the Daniels' Home for Hope. It was more than just a building. It was a legacy. A promise. A symbol of love. The full circle moment. Years later, Daniel sat on the porch of the new orphanage, watching as children ran across the yard, laughing, playing, living. Beside him sat his 6 daughters, now grown women, each one making a difference in the world. He turned to them, his heart swelling with pride. "You know, when I first met you, I thought I was saving you. But the truth is, you saved me just as much." Naomi smiled. "We all saved each other, Dad." The sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the orphanage, their orphanage. The place where their journey had begun. And as Daniel looked around, he realized something. This was never just about 6 little girls. It was about every child who had ever felt abandoned. It was about hope. It was about love. It was about family. And in that moment, Daniel knew, his legacy would live on forever.